Hello, we will be completing our 1.2 midpoint notes in this lesson. And make sure you write the date for today. So first we will define two words. The first word is midpoint. A midpoint is the halfway between two endpoints of a segment. So halfway between two endpoints of a segment. All right, next we are going to define a new word called congruent. And congruent means the same size and shape, both. Same size and shape. And we do have a symbol that we use for congruent. It is an equal sign with our enye symbol on top. In math, we like symbols because they allow us to write shorter statements with less writing. All right, and then we want to draw a diagram to help us understand these two words. So I'm going to start by drawing my segment. So I said a midway is halfway between two endpoints of a segment. So I have my two endpoints here. And I'm going to name my endpoints with a capital letter, A and B. So to find the midpoint of these 2 points, I want to look at the vertical and horizontal distance. And that was actually horizontal that I just drew. And here we are vertical. So our vertical and horizontal distances, if I figure out those distances and travel half as much, so about half of my horizontal distance would be here, and half of my vertical distance here, if I travel half as much, I will reach my midpoint M. Now my vertical distance, we have a special symbol for that as well. Triangle X, this is a Greek letter called delta. So delta X means the change in X, and delta Y for our vertical line means change in Y. Okay, and I want to make a couple statements about this diagram I drew here. First of all, M is, and actually I want to backtrack because I don't want to just call it M, I want to call it point M. Point M is the midpoint of segment AB. And I'm going to name my segment the proper way with the two endpoints and my line above. So point M here is the midpoint of segment AB. A second statement I have using this word congruent is that segments AM and MB are congruent. And that is because M is the midpoint. So if M truly is the midpoint, AM and MB are the same length. I can write this in a symbols only statement, and I'm going to change my colors here. In a symbols only statement, I would write AM, I do have my line on top there, is congruent to MB. And that is that same statement. Segment AM and segment MB are congruent. Okay, one last thing about this diagram is since A and B are points, I do want to reference how a point will have a coordinate if it is on the coordinate plane, consisting of x and y. And since A is the first point, we can call its coordinate x1, y1. Now B also will have its own coordinate, and I can call that one x2, y2. All right, so let's get into our examples, and what we are going to be using in our examples here is the midpoint formula. In the midpoint formula, I am going to take my first and second x, x1 and x2, I'm going to add them together and divide by 2. And I will do the same thing with y1 plus y2, add them together and divide by 2. So I want to decide what is my x1 and x2, y1 and y2. So those are going to come from the point here, and I was asked to find the midpoint. Locate the midpoint. So to do that, I do want to break down my points. I have x1 and y1 here. I'm going to use green, y1, and then I have x2, y2. Or in other words, x and y of my first point, x and y of my second point. All right, I'm going to go into plugging into my formula, and I am going to maintain the colors. If those are helpful to you, you can use this 2 colors as well. So my x colors are in blue, and first I'm going to go into my formula, and I'm going to be doing this x1 plus x2 divided by 2 part. So x1 is right here, -3, plus an x2 over here is 9. And I do need to divide that by 2 after solving. Getting into my green part of my midpoint, which goes with my y values, I'm going to take y1 plus y2 divided by 2. So y1 here is -4 plus, and y2 is -12. I am using the parentheses to show that this is -12. This does not mean multiplication. All right, now it's time to solve. So I have -3 plus 9, which comes out to -6. There are, oops, my apologies, that is +6. There are more positives here, and then subtract 9 minus 3 is 6. I still need to divide that 6 by 2. And then for my y values, I have -4 plus -12, or -16. They are both negative, so add them together and keep the sign. All right, and I have one more step to continue solving here. 6 divided by 2 is 3, and -16 divided by 2 is -8. So my midpoint is 3, -8. I can always verify this midpoint by graphing if I like, so I'm going to show that now. All right, so my coordinate plane, I'm going to draw here. Oh, excuse my squiggles. My point is at -3, -4. That's my end point. I have 9, so 3, 6, 9, and then down 12, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12. I believe it's right there. I'm going to pause and double check. Yep, and we're all good there. And then what I established as my midpoint, Excuse me, my pen isn't working. Okay, what I established as my midpoint along this segment was the point 3, -8. Okay, and I think I misdrew my line a little bit. We're going to verify by counting the horizontal and vertical distance. So I see my horizontal distance to get to my midpoint is 6 here, and my vertical distance is 4. Is that 4? Yeah, 4. Then if I replicate that same distance, I should go to the right 6 again. And I do, that is 6 here, and down 4. So as we've gone over the counting method to find the midpoint, we also can use the formula and then verify by graphing. So we do have 2 methods to find midpoint. All right, I'd like to do one more midpoint example, and feel free to pause the video now to try this out on your own. All right, and I've written the formula again over here for reference. You do not need to write it a second time. I'm going to now label my points, my x1, y1, and x2, y2. So my first point has an x and y, that's why it's called x1, y1. My second point has an x and y, that is why it's called x2, y2. All right, let's get into plugging into our formula. So x1 is -4 plus x2 is 1. I do need to divide that by 2. Always in the midpoint formula. Now I put a comma in between because I'm going to end up with 2 values, a coordinate, an x value and a y value. I take my first y value, 3, and I add it to my second y value, -3, and that is also divided by 2. Going on into solving, -4 plus 1 is -3. And -3 plus 3 is 0. Those are opposite, inverse operations. Finally, I do my division and I get -1.50. And that is my midpoint. If you care to graph, you can do that, as I did in the previous question. Okay, we're going to make it to a different type of problem than what we just did in example 2 and 3. Excuse me, this should be example 3. I'm going to fix that. Okay, this is example 3. All right, and in this case, we are asked to find the other endpoint. Now, I want to do this both by graphing and more formulaically using formula. So we'll start with the graphing way. So I'm finding the other endpoint. Other endpoint. That means I already know my midpoint and I need to find the other endpoint. I'm given an endpoint and a midpoint. So my endpoint and midpoint I'm going to graph here, keeping in mind that I'm not trying to find the middle of these two numbers. I want to know the other endpoint. Okay, so my endpoint is 5, 3. So that's going to be here, and I'm going to write the word E next to that. This is my endpoint. My first one at that. Now my midpoint is at -1, 0. This is my midpoint. I do not want to find a point in between these two to call my midpoint. What is happening is I have this line that I need to extend and figure out where does it end over here in this direction. Remember, I want my other half of my line segment to have the same distance as from M to E. So I'm still going to be counting that vertical and horizontal distance. So I can see from M to E, my horizontal distance is 6. And my vertical distance is 3. So to get to my other endpoint, I need it to be the same distance away from M as E1. I'm going to move the same distance. So I'm going to go over 6. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So all the way to here. And then down 3. Down 3. Replicating those same distances will get me to my midpoint. So my midpoint, or excuse me, my other endpoint is right here. And I can see I have the same distance from M to E1 as I do from M to E2. First and second midpoint. And I have my segment here that is broken up into 2 congruent parts. So this would be the method of finding the other endpoint with a graph. Now I do still want to finish up and write the ordered pair of the other endpoint, and it looks like we are at -3, 6, 7, -7, -3. Remember, I'm always counting from 0, 0 here. So I go over 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. That's where my -7 comes from. And going down the y-axis to get to this point is going to take me there, and that's -3. And there we have it. That is my other endpoint. All right, and we're going to do just one final example of this. This is example 4. Find the other endpoint. So I'm going to really do the same thing that I was doing with the graph, but I'm going to be looking at the numbers in my points. And I think it's best if I stack the numbers on top of each other like this. So what happens when I do that is it aligns my x values here and it aligns my y values here. So this is my first endpoint, and this middle point should be my midpoint, which I did do that way. And rather than counting spaces, I want to think, what happened to get from -2 to 0? How many spaces am I moving on the graph? So I'm over at -2 on the x-axis. I'm moving towards 0, 2 spaces. That is an increase of 2. -2 plus 2 will give me 0. I also want to look at what is happening to the y values. So I'm going from 7 to 4. It means I'm up here at 7. I'm going down toward 4. I'm decreasing my y values. 7 to -4 would have to be a decrease of, so I'm going to go all the way from 7 to 0, then to -4, and that would be down 11. Now to get to my other endpoint, I want to move the exact same distance. So the distance from 0 to my x value of my endpoint should be 2 spaces away. So that makes 0 plus 2, 2. That is going to be the location of my x value. Now for my y value, I also want to decrease 11 spaces or numbers. I have -4 minus 11, and that gives me -15. So this is my other endpoint. I can still go back and graph it like the previous way, but this is for those of us that don't like to use a graph and prefer to count or look at the numbers themselves. So we're really doing the same process through different methods. Thank you for sticking through this video, and let me know if you have questions.